Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining this Daniel Estulin. Welcome to Estulin Media. Today, my guest is my friend from Montreal, Canada. His name is Matt Ehret. He's the author of a recently released book called Science Unshackled, Restoring Causality in the World of Chaos. And it's a sequel to his previous book called The Clash of the Two Americans. And Matt is also a journalist, he's a historian. Well, anyway, he's going to tell us, we're going to talk about this wonderful book, which I finished this morning. Matt, first of all, thank you so much for joining us again. It's an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, it's an honor to be with you, Daniel. I've been a big fan for a long time, and I'm happy that we've had a friendship now for a bit. So it's always a great time talking to you.
Yeah, it's your latest book, as you say, it's about science, which involves delving rather deeply, as you say in the book, in matters of philosophy, epistemology. How did this project come about? Because again, this isn't really your cup of tea, or is it?
No, originally this came about as a consequence of having written a 4-volume series of books on the Clash of the Two Americas, and I realized that what was implicit but not explicit throughout the entire storyline is why it is that the vast majority of people, especially seemingly educated people, are completely incapable of recognizing the fact that there is a battle of two opposing worldviews that have been imprinting themselves and shaping the entire experience of the United States from the earliest moment to the incarnation that we might call this deep state or whatever shadow government, whatever you want to call it, this foreign parasite fifth column that's been implanted and has been continuing itself or replicating something virulent within the heart of America, overseeing the murder of many presidents, which also is itself a 250-year expression of something much more broad, a multi-century, multi-millennial process of a clash between different views of the nature of God, the universe, creation, and specifically humans, that shaped all battles to enforce and maintain systems of tyranny, while on the other hand, to liberate humanity from systems of tyranny, even at the cost of one's own life. So this is something that is very clear when you just look at it, but so many people in our current age are incapable of seeing it. And it seems like the more time you spend in university studying history, political science, the less capable one becomes at appreciating or being sensitive to this clash. And so part of this has to do with a sleight of hand that occurred within the education system itself, within the very domain of what is called science. So this current book, it could have otherwise have been called The Clash of the Two Sciences, which I almost called it, to get across that there's not just one Western scientific tradition, as we're often told in an oversimplified fashion, but there are opposing ideas that are incompatible about what this thing called science is. Whereas one side posits that science is the obedience to a consensus grouping of experts that create a standard model language that anybody who wants to have a job or privilege should abide by.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other grouping rejects that because this other grouping loves truth more than being popular or having money or being part of an inner club, because they recognize that discoveries are made in spite of consensuses, not because of consensuses. And for this, there's certain characters throughout the book series from Plato onward and the Platonic school, especially of Augustinian scientists throughout the ages, who play a very big role at making discoveries in opposition to the priesthood, who are often celebrated in our current age as being the sacred cows, the new godheads of science that we have to assume were these great geniuses who had apples fall on their head and discovered laws of the universe, which is not true.
We're going to get into that. As an opening, I
Yes.
think as an opening question, you talked about a lot of different things, but I think for the purposes of being concrete, so let's look at the sides. So who are these they on both sides of the equation?
Well, I think you and I are sort of zeroing in on the similar characters on the stage of history. I sort of find I find it comfortable in my mind to it's difficult to put a label onto the thing itself, this parasitical agency, which has been trying to keep human beings locked in a cave, believing in shadows, rather than allowing human beings to be who we actually are designed to be. I tend to think of it as a nested set of bloodlines and families that utilize cults and mystery religions to initiate themselves and to maintain a system of ideological and psychospiritual controls over generations, including controls over their own the heirs of their own clans, of these bloodlines, who have to be groomed and broken of their humanity to be defenders and advocates of this artificial, very perverse system that these kids are born into, of the higher families. And so that's how I'm sort of seeing the they who have been derailing history in a bad direction.
You know, amongst the there's a lot of wonderful and fascinating things that you discuss in you, but you pay special attention, homage, I'd say, to a man. I also great man. Right, we're going to be talking about Aristotle. We're going to be talking about Plato, but the man I'm referring to specifically, as you most likely know, is Edgar Allan Poe. Why do you admire him as much as you do?
Well, yeah, he comes up in the second chapter of the book,
Yes,
and I find that, well, everyone knows of Poe, but I only had an ability to appreciate the real Poe, having had spent a number of years of my life as a volunteer with the Schiller Institute, working with associates of Lyndon LaRouche, and some of those researchers did some incredible pioneering work. And I found great value in the work of Alan Salisbury, a late associate of LaRouche, who had looked into the question of Poe as a political intelligence agent for the patriots of the United States, and embedded within Poe's fiction and his nonfiction remarks are deep, profound insights into the nature of oligarchical systems. And Poe had a very specific, very last essay devoted to Alexander von Humboldt. And Poe was a great fan of Humboldt, and in 1848 published this thing called Eureka, his thoughts on the spiritual and material universe. And that essay might have some flaws epistemologically speaking, but it's a beautiful essay, and he really sheds light on something that I thought only LaRouche was talking about, which was, at the time, you know, LaRouche was describing the nature of the fallacy of the deductive, inductive lines of reasoning that are controlled by either followers of Paulo Sarpi, who have maintained a system of control over humanity, or at least grand strategy, to encourage technique and sense perception based science but not the fruit of the love of truth and the real method of how the mind makes discoveries, which was also adopted and advanced by people like Francis Bacon, called a posteriori thinking. Or inversely, the opposing school was the school of Aristotle, that said all we have are these general assumptions that we have to believe blindly in, and which we fit the sense perception of the universe into a box shaped by an interpretation based on these basic assumptions that are universal. In both cases, these are flawed pathways. So when I read Poe and the Eureka essay that he wrote right before he died, and he was probably killed because of what he was doing, he lays it all out very beautifully of these false pathways, and he celebrates the figure of Kepler, whom he translated, Poe, in the form when he describes how one path is called creeping, he calls the other path crawling, as the two permitted paths towards knowledge, when he says that the soul doesn't creep or crawl by nature, but wants to soar. And he describes the soaring of Kepler and Kepler's discovery of the harmonics, of the musicality organizing the orbital pathways of the planets. And that's what Edgar Poe zeroes in on as his homage to what real science should be, as the basis of poetry, that we recognize is that the creator is a poetic creator. It's not a dead or static or literal noun-based creator, but Poe's creator, his God, is a God of metaphor, that to be made in the image of this God, we have to tap into our creative poetic spark inside of ourselves, and then we could truly be what we were meant to be, which he, I think, really truly is, which is why his enemies had to kill him, because he was about to set up a news magazine based on this, called the forgot the name of it, but it's in my chapter. He was about to set up a news magazine to rally all of the like-minded thinkers around a new epistemological battle, based upon his essay on Eureka as a manifesto. So he was eliminated.
You mentioned in your book, and I thought it was very interesting, that Poe probed the depths of the human heart and also human mind, while the theme frequently orbit around mankind's unique capacity to make creative discoveries. So the question is, how have our creative powers of reason have been repressed by the elite?
Oh, you ask really good questions.
Sorry about that.
Well, yeah, surprisingly good. And it's rich. It's a rich question. But I think that there's a number of ways I could go about answering this, or and there's no single one answer, I think, that really, but I guess the thing that
I mean,
Poe was
I'm
trying to,
asking because I also don't really know the answer, so I want to know what you.
yeah. No, I know, and I don't really have, I don't have a final answer myself, but with the way I think about it and the way Poe thinks about it, in my sense, is that he's helping people to be liberated of the shackles of oligarchical cultural conditioning, which manifested in his war against the transcendentalist movement, the followers and acolytes of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who Emerson described himself as the lieutenant of Carlyle. Carlyle is a very high-level operator inside of England in British intelligence, running the Edinburgh Review, was a major influential person with John Ruskin and the pre-Raphaelite movement as well. Also John Darby, the Rapture creator, John Nelson Darby, was also an acolyte of Carlyle. So Carlyle created a movement of mysticism, of spiritualism, that was part of a program to intoxicate target audiences based on cultural profiles, and the Americans had their own cultural profile. So you had the New England Transcendentalists. A lot of them are tied and sponsored by the Cabots, the Lodges, the New England oligarchist families that were always loyal to the British higher operating system across the ocean. Poe was at war with them. That's part of what he did with his How to Write a Blackwoods article. His beautiful, hilarious attack on the this hypersensualist method of composition, which was turning people into creatures who were inclined towards romanticism, seeing themselves too literally, not being able to laugh at themselves or self-examine, and being really, really enshackled to the obsession with sensuality, senses. And so part of the program of this false dualism that's deployed against us all the time throughout history by the oligarchy is to, if you want to create a mystic, you create an over-literalist. So create a materialist, radical reductionist, and you will be able to easily make a mystic, but the bad kind of mystics, like somebody who's an irrationalist, superstitious, person who's so open-minded that their brains fell out. That's the sort of people that can be controlled, and they'll vacillate, which is why the Rosicrucians often have amongst their membership such figures as Isaac Newton, or many of the Cartesians, who
the last sorcerer, as they call him. Yep.
Yeah, the last Babylonian witch, not the first scientist. And so it goes hand in hand. It's always the case, because there's always something in the universe which can't be described by literalistic, logical, deductive computer thinking, which is what the British empiricist school has promoted. And so because that certain something always exists in the nonlinear creative universe that we find ourselves, that cannot be described.
Spark of reason.
Yeah, they will see things like these discontinuous leaps that tend to occur that are not gradualistic, and they will say, oh, the only way, or the appearance of the golden section, the divine proportion, and they'll say, oh, thus the only way to know it is through hyper mysticism that is devoid of reason or logic. It's something that you can only know through the mysteries, through occult rituals that allow you to be part of the inner elite with special mystical knowledge that you didn't really earn, but you've been brought through a process of self-induced brainwashing, which the Transcendentalists, that's the reason why they were part of these Freemasonic Northern Scottish Rite operations, just as their southern branch of the Scottish Rite was run by people like Albert Pike and others, who are all tied to the same British intelligence, Palmerston, Mazzini, Carlisle operation, running all sides, right? So Poe was at war with all of this, and he knew that there was the seed of corruption of the culture embedded in that. And I think that if you look at what his enemies were doing, you'll get a sense of how we're controlled, because his other enemies, like the founder of Sherlock Holmes, Doyle. He was part of the same transcendentalist Bureau for Psychical Research operation, trying to talk to ghosts and do seance and he was working very closely with these theosophists, just as Lord Balfour was.
And all these people, Crowley, Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, and his character of Sherlock Holmes was created literally to impose an Aristotelian response to the character of Dupin, who Poe crafted who represents a like a scientific, poetic personality type, very integrated, who can see beyond the senses, using the power of creative reason to discover things that all of the great professional investigators of France are incapable of doing, like in the case of the Purloined Letter or the murders on the Rue Morgue. So it's just to say that Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes was an attempt to destroy that or undermine what people could discover in the character of Dupin, made by Poe, by the character of Holmes, who is, if you use Holmes's method, you might end up like a Murder, She Wrote, Jessica, whatever, Lansbury type of character. It'll be useless if you actually try to discover anything true. You're just going to be using your senses and making weird deductions that are unconnected to reason, but somehow making you almost like a superhuman Jedi that can discover things that are almost magical.
Matt, you mentioned culture. Let me ask you this: what role has culture? Again, let's think of the answer. What role has culture played in defining who we are as people, or who we are as humanity?
Everything. What is culture? That's the thing. What is culture? I know you know this, but for people listening, it's
not for us. I mean, you and I are having a conversation, but a whole lot of people sitting trying. We're trying to educate people to think non-linearly.
Yeah. Well, culture is one of these fun. It's almost like it's a very obscure word that I think when it's so rich because it's sort of like this invisible field that shapes our identities, our feelings, our passions, our thoughts. And that both shapes us, that shapes the individuals that are born into society materially. We're born with a material body, with material parents. We're going to have a material death. But then there's this other spiritual thing, this field that maintains a continuity of ideas, of feelings, of identity, that transmits and maintains either something that is going to be getting better or decaying and getting worse, that we can in turn influence. So it's influenced also by particular individuals. So you could be a Mozart, you could be a Bach, you could be a Kepler, and play a role in positively upshifting that culture that itself shaped you. So it's a reciprocal give and take. Or you could be also, unfortunately, like a Carlyle or somebody like a Ruskin, who is who also plays a role influencing the culture, but towards idea sets that are devoid of truth, or that tie us more to a cult of ugliness, worshiping decay over life, things like that. So it's a very rich idea.
I have a much simpler. What you said, I totally agree with you. I would explain it. Culture is ethics, aesthetics, and logic.
Yeah, those are the categories that make up culture. Yeah.
And then you can expand it obviously into another realm, but the gist of it. What about imagination? Because again, one of the things I loved about your book is that you focus on scientific discovery. You focus on a lot of the work that LaRouche has done over the years, and I've also collaborated with the LaRouche and Helga for many years, going back to 2006 or 2007. So it's been a long time. But one of the things that the elite have always tried to suppress is the imagination. So what role does imagination play in our ability to understand the world around us?
Well, I think the imagination is the most powerful tool we have to tune ourselves to the universe, because we'll never see everything. We'll never see the universe. We'll never see God with our eyes. We'll never see all of humanity. So to see these things requires the mind's eye, which has to imagine an idea of humanity per se, the universe per se, which we'll never know perfectly logically, but the idea of the future doesn't exist yet. It's something we have to imagine. The past, generations long past that I study, I will never see it directly. I have to infer it through writings, getting to know Augustine, getting to know Thomas More, others, and I have to infer the world that they're living in with my imagination. So the imagination is so important to tie us to the past, to tie us to an idea of what the future could be, as far as there's many possible futures based on our choices that we have made, for good or for bad. And so what will be the more healthy, natural futures that will be both possible and necessary? Because things can be both either possible or necessary, but things that are possible are sometimes not necessary, and things that are necessary are not always possible. So you want to do things that are both. And
And
so
of
to
course,
imagine,
imagination is something that no animal can do. I mean, we can do that. We can imagine things because we have this divine spark of reason. Now, if we have this divine spark of reason, how would you define divinity from God's perspective? Again, I don't know the answer.
mm,
From God's perspective and also from human beings' perspective.
mm. Well, if I would approach it from the standpoint of what are what is there evidence to know that humans have a purpose beyond simply living
Sorry
and
to interrupt you. The
existing?
reason I was asking you
Yeah.
because I was actually you. It's your fault. But you made me think of a lot of these things because, for example, in your chapter 2, which is does life or death govern the universe? So I started asking myself, well, how do we define that?
Mm,
Okay, because again, if we're talking about divinity, if we're talking about life, we're talking about imagination, if we talk about spark of reason, because universe is a big thing around us,
mm,
which means you have to elevate yourself to a certain level to be part of this or be worthy of the world
mm,
around us. And how do we
mhm.
become worthy?
Yeah, well, I think this comes down to a question of well, in the Bible, in the book of Matthew, there's a point where Jesus is asked what's the most important of the Ten Commandments, right? And he answers famously, he doesn't mention any of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt nots or anything like that. He doesn't mention any of he says, love God and love your fellow man. And, if you combine that with, and the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, if you just do those things, they're all different parts of the same thing, then it will be implicit that the other 10 things in the book, in the books that Moses, or in the tablets that Moses brought down from Sinai, will be true. You will implicitly do that. You don't have to be told not to kill or anything, or not to steal. Love God, love your fellow man, and respect yourself, right? And you see that manifest in other cultures too. You see that there's a golden rule manifesting in the Bhagavad Gita, in the stories there. You see it also in the Upanishads. You see it also in Mencius, in the followers of Confucius, who have a negative version of it. Don't do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. So the very same concept is discovered across the board. And I think when we do it, we become happier, we find more peace, we live better. We create a climate where our children are more secure. We're more inclined to make discoveries. We're more inclined to find a spirit of openness to apply new thoughts, new discoveries to our way of life that makes life better for us, whereby we can overcome limits to growth whenever we have that attitude of heart.
That's something
And
that you and
so,
I talked about a lot in the past.
yeah,
Earlier we talked about, sides, who are the sides. Specifically, what's the difference in method of thinking expressed? Plato school, that's us,
yeah,
versus Aristotelian school, that's them.
oh yeah. Well, I think one big difference is the sense of an immortal soul. That because to be a Platonic teacher, like let's say an Anne Sullivan, who's a Platonic teacher, is a Platonist teaching Helen Keller, a child who doesn't have use of sight or hearing. Does Anne Sullivan describe her method of being successful, where all the experts failed in her day at teaching a child like this to learn how to use her mind and read, even when she couldn't hear or see, since she was a wee little baby? And Anne Sullivan describes how, in her autobiography, and Keller describes in her own words, this process where there was a belief that there was a soul made in the image of a creator inside that child that had to be brought out. You want to awaken it as a teacher. You want to create a condition where that student is more curious, ideally, if they have sight and hearing, that the kid is being guided to perplexity, to paradoxes, to see where your assumptions break down when pressed on reality, which is the purpose of a teacher, not to give finalized answers onto a blank slate that you impress upon, the way an Aristotle would say we're born with tabula rasa, that can only have knowledge put onto it from the outside by whoever is controlling the standards or definitions of that society. So it takes you into two different universes using similar words, but meaning something very different. If you believe that there's an intrinsic soul made in the image of a creator, as Plato goes through in his Timaeus and many places in the Theaetetus, in the Mino, versus an Aristotle who denies all of that, as he does in his Politics or in his Nicomachean Ethics. or Aristotle's presumption that, you know, some are naturally born to be slaves and many and a few are born to be masters, and that's built into the fabric of the universe, which Plato disproves in his Mino Dialogue.
I was going to ask you about that tabula rasa. That was proven wrong in Plato's Mino Dialogue. What is the Mino Dialogue, and how does he disprove it?
It's a story of a young boy who's a slave boy of Mino, who's an aristocrat. And Plato is demonstrating, or is asking Mino about the nature of virtue. And Mino's having a tough time answering it, and is demonstrating a very Aristotelian set of answers by saying, well, there's one virtue for the slave, one virtue for the master, one virtue for the servant, one for the wife, one for the, and Plato's trying to get across, well, wait a minute, I don't think you fully understand what I'm saying. I asked for one virtue, you're giving me many's. You know, and so he says, well, let me give you, maybe this is too hard of a too challenging of a question for where you're at. Let's try to like shift gears a little bit. And he brings over the slave boy, maybe 10 years old, not too much of an education. And he says to the slave boy who's owned by Mino, well, do you know geometry, young boy? And he's like, well, no. But he's like, do you know what a square is? Kid's like, yeah. It's like, okay, well, can you draw a square? And he draws a square in the sand. And he basically, threw a series of questions, asked the kid about how he can double the surface area of the square while keeping the identity of the thing still a square. And the kid tries one thing, doesn't really work, tries another thing, doesn't really work. Then, in the process of just asking questions, the kid generates the solution concept, which involves a leap into the transcendental, because there's nothing in the domain of simple deduction that would extrapolate out into a solution. You can't do it. It requires a shift in thinking. And anybody who's ever made the solution themselves realizes how this works. And then he returns back to the question of, well, what is virtue, to Mino? That part of that presumed that the child had the answer already embedded within his heart and mind. And all the teacher had to do was find a way to help kindle what was already there, but sleeping. And a discovery in that sense is kind of like a recollection, but in a forward vector. So in the case of, as he describes, most people think of recollection of, I lost my cup. Well, where did I find it? Well, I know what my cup looks like. So when I find it, oh, it's over there. I found my cup. Because you had a recollection, you knew what it was. A discovery in Plato's world is kind of like a recollection, but again, vectored into the future, because you've never experienced the discovery that you have to make. So how would you know that you've made the discovery? Once you felt that eureka moment, how do you know that that's a discovery? You've never discovered the answer. You've never experienced it the way I have my cup that I lost. So it must be because there was something already there imprinted that allowed me to recognize, aha, my search can now be said to be over. I have found what I was looking for, eureka. And that was sort of the thing that Mino couldn't get. Mino actually threatened Plato or Socrates' life in the course of that dialogue in an indirect way.
You know, we're talking about shifting and thinking versus empiricism. So what is empiricism, and how does our adherence to the principles damage their ability to think creatively and also to discover universal principles of nature?
Yeah. Well, the belief in sense, if you believe that the mind can only be responsibly scientific and seek into the unknown that we were born into, we're mapping the unknown, right? As we're trying to figure things out in the course of our lives. If you think that the only pathway you have is through your five senses, then you are an empiricist. That's the name that was given to that school of thinking that emerged out of Paulo Sarpi. John Locke is another one, and Francis Bacon is another one. It has a few problems, and Isaac Newton in his Principia Mathematica, in his rules of reasoning, because he says, if you want to be a great genius like me, use my rules of reasoning that you have to abide by to be a genius. And one of them is, do not make hypotheses. Do not use your creative imagination to render a hypothesis to a solution. Simply make observations like a computer would. He didn't know about computers so much, but make observations, look for patterns, impose a formula onto a pattern that your senses can show you, call it a law. And maybe you'll get lucky and fruit will drop on your head and, whatever. So that's empiricism in a short box, but it's a cage that keeps your mind from being able to soar and make discoveries, because we are more than our five senses.
Do not make hypotheses, and that's where Newton comes against Leibniz. The battle of the Titans, Renaissance versus empiricism. How did that? Can we give us a brief version of what was behind, again, because we're talking sides. So Leibniz, that's one of us. That's one of the good guys. He's on our side, and we're on his side. Okay,
Yeah, we are.
you,
Yeah.
you are, you know, he's not one of us. He's against us. He's the enemy. Okay, so
I
what's this?
I love the fact that you know about all this stuff. Like it's great. It's like I
Well, you
can't talk
know,
like that. I can't talk like this with most people.
those of us who read, you know, and I read
Yeah.
a, when I come from the Soviet school of reading, you know, I told you before, we were taught to read
Hmm.
300 pages a day. And so we
Hmm.
eat the same way people eat. You know, the bodybuilder eats this enormous, you know, lunches and breakfast and 15 meals a day, and they have no trouble doing that. You know,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
we've been
Well,
taught to read, so we can read 300 pages, which means you can, you know, intake a
you've
lot
you've
of information.
you've earned you've used your skill set well.
Yeah.
Okay, so to answer that very good question, I would say Gottfried Leibniz is a mathematical philosopher, scientist, statesman, who was one of these just once in a lifetime. I mean, you'd wish that there were more than just one per lifetime, but he was really one of these exceptional human beings who was making breakthroughs in everything he was touching, kind of like a Leonardo da Vinci type of character. Everything he puts his mind to, his passion to, he makes revolutionary, paradigm-shifting breakthroughs. He's also takes up a challenge left by Kepler earlier about Kepler's difficulty as he was discovering his three planetary laws, peaking with his harmonic law, based on the musicality of the relationships of the orbits around his sun. There was a problem with Kepler's inability to have a language that would describe discontinuous change, because every orbit, you know, is an ellipse moving around a sun, meaning the distance and the speed is always changing at all times. And Kepler was able to fudge it a little bit through a technique that, anyway, I won't go into. But he said, look, there's a discovery to be made here. And he challenged in his book, The Harmonies of the World, in 1619, published, future mathematicians to come up with that solution concept, taking into consideration the physical geometries built into the fabric of physical spacetime. And so people like a generation later, Jean Bernoulli and his brother, Christian Huygens, who was a teacher of Leibniz and Leibniz big time, who many of them emerged onto the scene in Colbert's France, through the revolutions that Colbert and Mazarin had created in creating especially things like the French Academy of Sciences, that and their patronage of the arts and sciences and internal improvements that really was an upshift culturally and politically of France as a whole. Leibniz emerged out of this cultural vibrancy and took the challenge of Kepler earlier and solved the problem by developing with the Bernoullis his infinitesimal calculus, utilizing certain physical curves that look similar to parabolas like the hanging chain, but in fact are not the same thing as a parabola, which the Cartesians and the Galileans all said, no, it's the same thing, you could fudge it. And Leibniz was like, no, if we love truth, we recognize this is not sufficient. We need something else. And part of Leibniz's philosophy was that there is a built-in harmony, a pre-existent harmony in our soul that allows for that discovery, which is like an upgrade of, or at least a revival of, the Platonic thesis and the Pythagorean thesis. He was a Pythagorean in that sense. He was able to take with his monadology a sense that there are ideas that are transcendental, that exist in that are of a higher reality that we will never be able to know through senses, but is existent as sort of the realm of being described by Plato, in which all exists that ever could exist and ever will exist, that shapes as a blueprint reality, but not reality as a stasis thing, but reality as a perfecting thing, that everything is constantly yearning to express its perfect essence, in that way that the realm of being that transcends flux is shaping the realm of flux of becoming. So that was like Leibniz, at the heart of Leibniz's discourses on metaphysics and his monadology, is this cosmology, which runs directly in opposition to the Royal Society Rosicrucians, who wanted a cosmology of stasis, around which a higher ruling class could be able to control the shadows or the symbols for the masses and for themselves in a very bad perversion of science.
And of course, the other side of talking about them and us, we're talking about deductive and inductive. We're talking, Aristotle is represented a school of deductive reasoning, Francis Bacon, the school of inductive reasoning. And as you explain in your book, all of this was earlier pioneered by the Venetian monk Paolo Sarpi. So I don't think enough people know the role that Venice has played, or Venice practitioners have played with this realm of creative reason, how they were able to destroy it or obfuscate it.
No, they don't, and I mean, it's hard to begin to investigate it, because many of the official narratives of science history are influenced by those who would prefer that the truth of the battles around science throughout history be kept secret. So it's difficult to get at this. However, once you think like Kepler and you start seeing that there are these two different opposing currents in science, and one makes discoveries, the other tries to sabotage discoveries. And there's two ways that the oligarchy has gone about trying to sabotage discoveries. Number one is the old school Inquisition way, just try to use corrupt officials within the Vatican, within the Habsburg Empire or whatever, and just try to call everything that falls outside of a canonized set of behavior as heresy to be destroyed. Create the library of banned books, right, coming out of the Council of Trent, where Kepler was banned, Plato was banned on the banned books, or just burn the witch, whatever, you can do that too. If that doesn't work and you can't just suppress science, because maybe you got a Da Vinci, you got a more vibrant, bustling love for truth that can't be suppressed by being murdered or being just physically, iron fisted, then try to subvert it from within. Try to say, oh, we love science, get close to it, and then reinterpret what that thing was. That's more damaging in a sense. So Sarpi came up with that great idea, representing a faction within Venetian grand strategy, who were trying to put the genie of the Renaissance back in the bottle, undermined, because as the Renaissance was growing and the population growth was increasing qualitatively, quantitatively, new discoveries were happening, rendering people more dignified, less inclined to want to just go into a jihadi like religious war with their neighbor, as the Europe was burnt through crusades and self-induced self-annihilation, never-ending wars. So people all of a sudden respected themselves more. They were able to problem solve and create beautiful new things that were not monopolized by the old set of imperialists. So the older school of Venetians, that was the center of world finance, world maritime control. These were the sponsors of many of the later crusades that, anyway, it's a long story. There was an old school that said, no, we just need to keep doing things the old way we were doing them, and that always seemed to have worked. And the younger school, the younger grouping around that revolved around Paolo Sarpi, who's from a high-level Venetian family, said, no, we have to be more flexible. We need a new way. And that new way involved the creation of what became known as liberalism. That we should just be accepting and be more fluid and adaptive, not so rigid. And that way, anything new, we will be able to roll with it and then make it our own, and then diffuse it so that science becomes technique, not the technology, not the actual spirit of what gave rise to the discovery, but will allow the technique of using mechanical arts or memorizing formula. That'll be okay. We'll call the science the formula of right, that people can memorize and apply and be maybe kind of useful, of the inverse square law, which was derived directly from Kepler's harmonic law, his third harmonic law, made way before the inverse square law of Newton. But we will extract the substance that made the formula, the Eureka, possible. That substance of Kepler's love of truth, his sense of the harmony of things, that will annihilate that, and we will say that the formula is really the end all be all. But that will destroy the ability for future discoveries to be made. So that's the Sarpi sort of sleight of hand.
You know what? Something that they haven't been able to, through any sleight of hand, to obfuscate is the idea or the definition of consciousness. What is consciousness from Plato's point of view?
Well, I think from Plato's point of view, it's tied to, it's not just the consciousness of like my cat or a parrot or a fish, which is conscious. It knows that there is something that it's operating within, but it's like got awareness, but the awareness is devoid of certain things that you find within a human consciousness. It's not the same consciousness. There's something similar, but something different with the human. And I think the human is giving us a greater degree of proximity towards the essence of the creator, if we're truly made in the image of the creator and can participate in creation, then we should be able to exemplify to a greater degree than the other animals what that creator is in a healthy integrated human being, which is tied to being aware, but aware with a love. It's tied to a yearning as well as a sense of the good, a sense of the beautiful that has to animate our perception. So we're not just looking at the consciousness of being, but the consciousness also of becoming at the same time. So I'm aware that I am, but I'm also aware that I'm changing. And so that both of those things have to work together for a moral tempering, not just any old thing.
I like that.
Yeah.
I think I like that. I think consciousness is something we each develop to the degree we feel and think for ourselves. Insofar as we merely accept the emotional, also intellectual commonplace of others, I think we remain dead, which is what basically happens all the time today. And so apart from accepting that everything should be directed towards a common purpose, I think we should champion the rights of minds to follow their own curiosity, wherever it may be, because curiosity is insubordination in its purest form. And that attitude today, in today's America, in today's Canada, would draw you a prison sentence for anti-American, anti-Canadian, anti-whatever you want to call it activity.
Yeah, right. No, I think, and it does require a love to be truly able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to be truly curious, means that you have to love something more than yourself in that sense. You have to be humble to know that if I'm truly curious and I'm doing it fruitfully, I have to be aware that what I think I know, I may not know. I have to be able to self-examine my heart and my mind to see where my false thoughts, my false misplaced feelings might be located, tied to wrong thoughts. So that type of introspectionism requires humility, and you can't be arrogant. If you're arrogant, you're not able to self-examine, which denies you the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
The less you read, the more arrogant you are.
Yeah.
The less you know, the more you want to think you know. You know, we are running, unfortunately, out of time. But you know, at the end of your book, which again, we're going to give the name and the title, and you're going to tell people where they can buy it. But you asked some very interesting questions, and one of them is, what types of art reflect that divine sense of humankind? Because the whole concept of divinity is something that I think about a lot. Divine spark of reason improves the lives of humanity per square kilometer of space against nature. That's something that Lynn always talked about. You can do that physically, you can do that metaphysically, you can do that metahistorically, or psychohistorically. But what type of art? Because again, you look at today's art in general, it's all garbage. But there is a reason why it's garbage. There is a reason why they call a hole in the wall, okay, an art that sells for $1 million.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into the fact that they're, you know, laundering drug money. Okay, that doesn't matter.
There is that.
The point is, what type of art reflects that divine sense of who we are as people? Because again, you have Raphael, you have Leonardo da Vinci, you have Veronese, and then you have a hole in the wall.
Yeah, right. Yeah, did that just naturally occur as a new genre of Jackson Pollock and modern art just naturally? No, of course not. There's always intervention from above, cultivating things in a negative way when they go downhill like that. It's like terrorism. Is it a natural sociologically occurring phenomenon that just happened? No, there's artificial promoters of this who are artificially making this happen, and thus we're being told it's a problem. So I think the thing with art, any type of art which is anti-oligarchist, which oligarchies will try, whether in China or in India or in the West, to try to undermine, will be anything which connects us to our universal sentiments, which Schiller has made his life studying and bringing about inside of himself and inside of others, is the universal sentiments, the things that, you know, there's things that make me distinctly different from others, but then there's the things that are the same. And the sense of feeling that you get when you see a grave injustice happening, that sense of internal dissonance that we feel when we look at a tragedy, a classical tragedy by a Schiller or a Shakespeare, is a sense of that, it doesn't have to be this way. And that hurt, the spiritual pain, comes also with a pleasure, a melancholy. It's melancholy, but it comes with a pleasure because you're enjoying the form of the drama, of the scenario. The storyline's very creative, but it's also making you a person that's more effective, more sovereign, because you're coming out of that experience a better person, more sensitive to folly inside of yourself. There's a little Hamlet inside of all of us that we can be made aware of. I despise evil a lot more. I'm more aware of it when I look at an Iago, or the Iago principle as a universal principle of evil embedded in every oligarchical system. The character in Othello that induces Othello to kill everybody he loves, his wife, his best friend, and then himself, who's this Venetian agent. That represents something of a universal character that undermines the good. So I think that, yeah, anything that ties us to our universal goodness and brings that about more in self-awareness is an art form, whether music or drama or painting, that would be considered to be of high quality. You want more of that sort of thing. And anything which does the opposite is usually going to make you more of a slave. And I would just say one thing: Paul Robeson is a wonderful human being who is an anti-imperialist artist, actor, singer, right? But he made a point speaking to the Republicans in Spain in 1937, where he said, look, the artist has a choice at these times of historic moments to either devote their services to the principle of slavery or the principles of freedom. And I've made my choice. It's to freedom that he devotes himself as an artist. But many artists, unfortunately, go for the bread-fed scholar approach and just want to, be famous as a Beyonce or a Doja Cat or something.
It's much easier. But one question, last question. If we're talking about cultural sophistication, would you say that cultural sophistication allows us to judge better right from wrong?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. The ability to judge right and wrong is definitely influenced by our sense of beauty and ugliness, which itself are very much affected by the cultural matrix and the arts that affected us. Yeah.
Yeah, because again, it's not the same listening to Bach or to Mozart, to Beethoven, or looking at a Rembrandt painting, than listening to Dr. Dredd or whatever the hell his name is. These people who smoke marijuana and dance rap music or sing or whatever they do. Well, they call themselves poets, but when I think of poetry, I think of Shakespeare, I think of Pushkin, I think of Lermontov. I don't think of a rapper, whether he's black or white, as an artist. Matt, thanks so much for your time. I mean, there's just so many things. This is an amazing book. It really is. There's so many things I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you about a closed system versus an open system. I wanted to ask you about Leibniz's dispute with Locke and Descartes and you. There's just so much stuff we didn't get to. I gotta get you back on again sooner rather than later.
It's always edifying speaking with you. So just say the word, and we'll happily.
I'd love to. I'm very mindful because I know you and your wife, who's also an amazing researcher, and I had her on as well once. We gotta get her back again. You guys are always so busy doing stuff, and I don't want to infringe on your time, but I'd love to have you back because. We can talk about, De Cousa, or Nicolas Cousa's amazing work, and Helga Zeppler, she's, one of the foremost scholars in the world on Cousa's work.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I got to get you back. But before we go, how can people find you and how can people buy your book, most importantly?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for the plug. Yeah. Okay. So CanadianPatriot.org or RisingTideFoundation.net are my two big websites. Also Substack, MatthewEhret.substack.com has
Ehret.
Yeah, I'm assuming they could just go to the description box under this video and get those links. My book is very easy to find. The Clash of the Two Americas book series is easy to find. The Untold History of Canada book series that I wrote as well is easy to find, all on the Canadian Patriot website. That's a lot of stuff right there.
There's a lot of stuff. The things he taught you, I've learned about Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his link to the
Fabians.
Exactly, in the 1950s. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff there that I discovered reading your book.
Oh, yeah, thanks, man.
Thank you very much for being with us.
It was a pleasure.
Here. Bye.